We began a series 3 weeks ago that we're continuing with today called Illuminate. We're really looking at Jesus as the light of the world. And the first week, we started by looking at, we really truly began at the very beginning. We began at the origins of humanity. We began in the story of Genesis and this beautiful poem that describes God entering the chaos, the darkness, and speaking light and bringing order into the chaos. And then we connected that in the first week to the way that John opens up his gospel or his narrative or biography of Jesus. When John starts his biography of Jesus, he really attaches Jesus to this same story. Jesus being the firstborn of the new creation, he attaches by saying, we now live in a very dark place. The world is dark, it's messed up. And Jesus enters into that darkness, the Word enters into that darkness and brings light and brings order to the chaos. And that was what we saw the first week. And then we saw last week that Jesus really turns the tables on us. And while Jesus is the light of the world, coming in to eradicate the darkness and bring order, he then invites us to participate with that. And we saw back, even in the stories of Jesus with his disciples, he says over and over again, not only is he the light of the world, but then he looks at them and he says, you are the light of the world. In the same way that I have brought light into darkness and order into chaos, you do the same thing. You bring light into darkness. You bring order into chaos. That's who you are as my followers. You are a light on a lamppost. You are a city set on a hill so that people can see you shining. You light up the darkness. He gives this thing to us. This week, we're going to be looking at some very personal aspects to this. Jesus being the light of the world, us being the light of the world, what are the implications for us on a very personal level? And we're going to look at some of the same passages that we've looked at throughout the series. It happens to be that sometimes when I'm working on something, other people decide they want to help me with material. And sometimes that's good. This last week, I was actually driving just a couple of days ago out south of town at night, and I was actually headed out to meet Grant, our youth pastor here at Summit. And I was also on the phone with him, which I know some of you will probably write emails about me driving on my phone. I just justify it by saying it's better than texting. And I think it's far safer. So that's what I was opting for. So while I'm on the phone with him, driving in the dark, it's raining, it's kind of nasty out, kind of like miserable weather. I'm driving out in the dark on the Palouse Highway, kind of out that direction. And suddenly I hear this loud thud. And I said to Grant, oh man, I think I just hit something. Which when you're on the phone is not something you want to experience. Like, it's true. Like, what they say is true. And then I realized shortly after this, I didn't hit anything. It was actually my car just breaking down horribly out in the middle of nowhere. So, like, literally, I said to Grant, I said, oh no, man, I think my car is broken. And he goes, hey, I'll be right there. Like, I'll be there to help you. And so he shows up, and along with another friend, we're there. We're kind of working on this car in the dark, and I'm out there. And at one point, we were trying to look at things in the dark with the light. You see where this is going. And Grant, he goes, man, this is awesome. This is like another illustration for the series that we're in. Now, understand that, Grant, he's our youth pastor. I still think he has a glimmer of respect for me. So the whole time leading up to this, I'm just stay calm, working on the car. Set a good example for this young guy, I'm singing Christmas carols, At this moment when he says this, everything inside of me will be like, yeah, because that's what I need right now is another illustration, right? Oh, thank you, God, for stranding me out here in the dark so that I had something to talk about on Sunday. Yeah, that's awesome. So I was like, yeah, thanks, Grant. And I think literally that's kind of how I don't even remember clearly because I was just so burning with anger. And crawled into the car and I'm, laying on the ground working on this stupid thing. And then all of a sudden I realized he's right, but maybe not the way he intended. He's right because as I was thinking about it, I thought, you know what? I don't need one more illustration. I don't need one more example in my life of how miserable the dark is and how much I want to be in the light. I've had enough experiences, you know what I'm saying? I've had enough experiences of being in those kinds of situations where you go, you know what? I don't really need another illustration or another personal example to tell me that broken, dark scenarios are not where I want to spend my life, right? We all have these moments. We all have circumstances that we experience, and we wake up in the middle of relational brokenness. We've said something or done something, and a relationship has disintegrated, and you get in those spots and you go, I don't ever want to see this again, right? Like we have moments when we do things and we regret things and we wake up and we have these questions. I mean, sometimes it's being in that moment of spiritual emptiness or spiritual darkness where we find ourselves not being able to resolve the deepest questions of the soul, and you find yourself in that place and you feel empty and purposelessness and loss, and you think, man, you have moments, you look back, or you're in those moments, you go, I don't ever want to have this again, right? Like we all have enough examples of dark moments to know that that's not where we want to be. But what's interesting is we keep finding ourselves there. Like not one of us needs another moment to go, man, Lord, I want to walk in the light. For those of us that are Christ followers, understanding what that means, like we don't need one more moment where we can say, man, this is so dark, I never want to be here again. And yet we find ourselves being there relationally, emotionally, spiritually. We find ourselves in those scenarios saying, this is dark and I don't want to be here. Why does that happen? Why does that happen? There's a part of us that knows like walking in darkness is miserable. In fact, even the Hebrews back in the Old Testament, the psalmist wrote in Psalm 119 verse 105. It's one of the first psalms that I ever remember learning as a kid, but it's also one that Jewish boys and girls have memorized growing up. The Hebrews understood this. It says that it's this kind of this plea. It says, Lord, let your word be a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. This idea of the word of God, like knowing, like, I don't want to walk in darkness. Like I've had enough of it, right? I've had enough darkness to know that I don't want to move forward. This picture that's painted by the psalmist is really a really cool one, because it's this idea, like the first word, a lamp, is literally like a candle, like a lamp that's burning. It's a lamp to my feet. Whenever you see feet used in the Old Testament, when you see these sorts of illustrations used poetically, it's a reference to the choices that we make. It's a reflection of the decisions that we're making. And so the psalmist says, Lord, let your light shine on the decisions, the choices that I make. Let your light, it's a different Hebrew word. The first word means lamp. The second word literally is illuminate. Would you illuminate my path? Would you reveal this path that I'm headed, this direction that I'm going? Would you reveal it to be what it is? Because when the light comes on, you see things for the way they are, right? Like when the lights turn on, any sense of not knowing what was really happening, any sense of not seeing the details of what was going on suddenly becomes evident, right? When the light comes on, we see things for as they really are. He says, I want you to be a lamp to my feet. Let me see the choices that I'm making. Would you illuminate? Let me see the truth, the reality of what is all around me. That metaphor is one we use in our culture, right? We say to things or situations, we'll say, well, let's shed a little light on this subject. And what are we saying when we say that? Let's put some light on this so we know what's really true about it, right? Let's shed some light on this relationship. Let's shed some light on this situation. Let's shed some light on this scenario that we're reading about in the news. When the light shines on, we see things as they truly are. The psalmist says, I want to see things the way that they really are. I want to see life the way that it's intended to be truly seen. I want to make choices that represent my actually having you with me, guiding the decisions that I'm making. The idea is so simple. Like I've done enough wandering in the dark, right? I've done enough fumbling. I've done enough of this waking up and going, why am I here again? That I don't want to do it anymore. There's another example of this in the New Testament, which is also really interesting. In the New Testament, there's an interesting story that takes place. The book of Acts, which falls in your New Testament shortly after the Gospels, the book of Acts is the story of the first churches that were started by Christ followers. Those stories are really dominated by a few different characters, the Apostle Paul being one of those. The Apostle Paul was a guy who was traveling all over the known world at that time, proclaiming the message of Jesus and really gathering people together in groups like this one. They were gathering together in churches that believed and followed Jesus. And there's a story in Acts chapter 17 that's fascinating, where the Apostle Paul, as he's traveling and sharing the message of Jesus, he lands in Athens, Greece. Athens is a fairly well-known city, right? Like that's one that even today we say, well, Athens is fairly well-known. It was fairly well-known then for what it's well-known for today. And that's not like economic bankruptcy by a government. That's not what I mean. But when we think of Athens, what do we think of? Think of philosophy, right? We think of Socrates and we think of Plato and Aristotle, right? Those are the people that we think of. We think of this idea. So the Apostle Paul, because of a set of circumstances, finds himself in the city of Athens, which is really interesting because here's the Apostle Paul who is teaching something that the world's never really heard before. I mean, this is a brand new way of relating to God. This is a philosophy like no other philosophy. He's spreading this message around the known world, and now he lands in what is the hub, the center of philosophy, the place where people brought ideas about how to make sense of life, what true reality was, and he's there. So after a few days, it actually says in Acts 17 that he kind of wanders a bit. He kind of sees the city. He's checking things out. He's sharing this message. And eventually what happens is he's called to talk about this, called to describe this thing that you're talking about with Jesus. Like, what is this faith in Christ? When he begins to teach them, he brings the same idea of wandering in the darkness, of fumbling through the dark, back to bear in this conversation. You can read these verses. You can follow with me. It's in verse 26 of Acts 17. He describes humanity in such a unique way. He's explaining this because mid-conversation, and he says, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. Some of your Bibles may say that we're groping into the darkness, we're feeling our way, we're fumbling through the dark. He's saying, listen, he's not far from us, and yet we find ourselves stumbling through, feeling our way. You've been in that moment, right? In the darkness, trying to discover how to get somewhere, walk through a house, walk through a room, and there's obstacles and objects, and you're feeling your way, you're fumbling your way, trying to figure things out. That is what Paul uses to describe the condition of humanity. He says humanity, and even speaking to all of these brilliant philosophers, he says humanity is fumbling in the darkness, feeling their way around, trying to answer these questions, trying to resolve the darkness. He's near, but they're in the dark. That makes what we've been looking at with Jesus that much more powerful, doesn't it? Like when the words of Jesus, when he describes who he is, they suddenly take on a gravity, a weight that is unlike anything else. Like Jesus addresses this so specifically. Like he understands we've had enough darkness. Whether it be personal, whether it be just philosophical, taking a step back and looking at culture, we can look and say we've had enough darkness. Like we want the light. We've been looking at John chapter 8 in this series several times, and we're going to look at it today again. But in John chapter 7, we really get the context for John chapter 8. In John chapter 7, there's a description of what's going on around the circumstances in Jesus' life with his disciples. The Jews are moving up to Jerusalem in John chapter 7, if you're into reading this. In John chapter 7, the Jews are moving there for the Feast of the Tabernacle. It's this time of celebration when the Jews would all gather up to Jerusalem to remember something specific. I'll reference in just a moment. But there's this time of celebration, and people are coming from all over to Jerusalem and to the temple. It's during this time that there's all kinds of speculation about who Jesus is, about his identity. Like people are hearing the stories and the things that he's saying, and they're saying, is he truly who he says he is? Or maybe they're just estimating. People off in the alleyways and corners and cafes, they're talking, saying, have you heard the things that Jesus is talking about, the things that he's doing? And some people were saying he's the Messiah. Some people are saying like he is God in the flesh. Some people are saying he's a prophet from the Old Testament. Some people were saying he's a good person who's teaching us good things. He's depositing some good stuff here with us. Then there was a whole other group of people, the other end of the spectrum, who said he's evil, he's deceiving us, he probably should be killed for these sorts of things. There's a spectrum of people and question. Everyone's wondering who this guy is. Who are his followers? They're watching the crowds gather around. And when Jesus is talking and teaching, those are the questions that are being asked in people's minds. That's the context. Everybody's here for this feast. They're all asking questions about Jesus. And it's in that scenario that in John chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus addresses the people this way. He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This is where Paul gets his inspiration in Acts chapter 17. He's saying, listen, you walk in darkness. Jesus himself is assuming, like, without me, you're fumbling in the dark. With me, there's light. He's saying, listen, there's darkness and you're in it. And then there's me. And I am the light of the world. I am the light of the world. And we have a lot of candidates for the light of the world in our culture today, right? Throughout history, there are a lot of candidates that say, oh, I'm the answer to this. I can resolve this. Or this is what will solve the darkness that humanity is walking in. If you go all the way back to the 17th and 18th century and go back to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a season in which humanity made the decision, philosophers made the decision to move humanity out of what they referred to as the Dark Ages. What's fascinating, the Enlightenment, I know some of you are like, I skipped this chapter when I was in high school and I shouldn't have, because I knew it was going to come back up, right? So I tell my kids, always pay attention. You never know when someone might say something at church and you want to know what they're talking about. But the Enlightenment comes along and they say, we want to bring us out of the Dark Ages. The Enlightenment very specifically was a re-embracing of the Greek philosophers. So think about this. The very darkness that the Apostle Paul was alluding to and identifying in Athens, the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, they were saying, we want to go back to the darkness of Athens. We want to go back to this place. And so the prominent way of thinking, the prominent way of understanding was this very humanistic, very autonomous, very self-driven, self-focused society. And so the Enlightenment took root. But the Enlightenment was literally just a return to what we already knew. Think about how things must have really been dark in the Dark Ages if returning to the darkness seemed lighter somehow, right? Like we call that the Enlightenment. And yet that Enlightenment continues to have implications on us as a culture today. You think about the way this moves forward. These kinds of thoughts and this way of thinking is still with us today. Some people say that knowledge is the light of the world, right? If we just increase the education, if we can just teach you enough, if we can educate you enough, if we can show you enough about who you are in humanity, and if we can just teach, then somehow education will be the light of the world and you'll be liberated from your darkness. If I can teach you enough, then eventually you won't fumble in the dark. That's something that's a part of our culture. It's a byproduct of being a Western society. That's the way that we think. Or we think that science is the answer, right? Like science, with all of its discoveries, they're wonderful. But science, as a way of answering these questions, says, well, if we can just understand more and more of the universe, if we can understand more of who we are as human beings, if we can understand this dynamic of us all working and living together, then we can become this superhuman force that rids the world of evil and bad. We become this group of people who are enlightened because we understand the way things work. Science is the light of the world, or even to go further, some sort of deep religious experience, some sort of deep spiritual connection, something that's emotional, something that makes sense to me, something that just resonates. We say, if I can just have this sort of experience, then I'll know that it's true. All of those things are residual effects of the Enlightenment. All of those things are residual effects of us being human, fumbling in the dark. And Jesus, knowing all of this, says, I am the light of the world. Which is fascinating. When Jesus says these words, you realize that Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, they had all been around and gone. Like everybody knew who they were, including Jesus. And Jesus says right in the middle of everyone knowing the philosophies by which people make sense of the world, I am the light of the world. It is this unequivocal statement. He says, this is who I am. I alone am the light of the world. Now, when Jesus said this, the setting of this is really also very fascinating. Remember, it's the Feast of the Tabernacles. All of these Jews who've traveled to Jerusalem, and now they're also gathering in the temple to celebrate this feast. And for us, we probably go, Feast of the Tabernacles sounds really confusing. Here's what's interesting. The Feast of the Tabernacles, this celebration took place in what was called the Court of the Women at the temple. And it was the most public place in the temple. So when all of the Jews from Israel came, it was the one place where just about everybody could be included in this space. And so it's kind of like a giant mall. It's this like courtyard type of area where everybody's gathered and they're hanging out and there's lots of activity going on as they celebrate this feast. Part of celebrating this feast was lighting candles that were on a candelabra. And there were 4 candles that were set in bowls of oil on this candelabra. And I know some of you are thinking like, is it just because it was dark, or what kind of detail is this? But this is fascinating because they were each lit one after another for each day of the festival to remember what God had done leading Israel out of captivity. So the idea of a feast of a tabernacle, the reason that phrase is used, tabernacle literally just means tent. And it was the Feast of the Tents. And the tents, whenever somebody said the tent or the tabernacle, it reminded people of when Israel was released from bondage, released from slavery, and they were traveling in the desert, and they literally, God's presence was in this tent, in this tabernacle. That's how they were worshiping God. And the way they were led during that season was by a cloud of smoke in the day and what at night? A pillar of fire, right? A pillar of fire. And so here they are. They're celebrating this Feast of the Tabernacles. Jesus is in this place. People are asking questions. And meanwhile, the candles are burning, reminding people of the way God led them with this very unusual light in the night. Reminding them of the bondage that they once lived in and the fact that now they're free. That's the setting that Jesus says this in. Jesus stands here while they're remembering God delivering people out of bondage, while they're remembering God leading them by a light. It's in this room, in that sort of scenario, that he says, I am the light of the world. You see what he's doing? He's in the court of women, celebrating this feast. Everyone's looking at the light, and Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. And there's no doubt about what he's saying. I am the light of the world. I'm the pillar of fire. I'm the lamp unto your feet. I am the light unto your path. I will walk you out of the darkness. I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And then a little bit later in verse 31, same conversation, same moment, same scenario. Jesus says, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. What does the light do? The light illuminates what is true about a situation. It illuminates what's true about our scenario, our emotions. We let the light shine. We know what's true. The truth will set you free. And then they answered him, we're offspring of Abraham, and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free? I love this response, because sometimes we talk about being in slavery. Sometimes we talk about the dynamic of wanting to be free and not being free. And in a culture like ours, we often respond to these sorts of statements the same way the Jews did. What do you mean? We're sons of Abraham. Like, we've never been imprisoned. We've never been slaves to anything. What would you set us free from, right? And we talk about the freedom that Christ offers, the freedom of the gospel. Oftentimes in our culture, we respond the same way. We say those things and we say, freedom, like, we live in America. This is a nation that's built on freedom. I'm not enslaved to anything. You can almost hear Jesus in that moment say, oh, really? Really? You're not a slave to your job? You're not a slave to the economy? You're not a slave to your emotions, to your sexuality, to the way that you think? You're not a slave to the way our systems and our culture work? Like, you're not a slave to those things? You're not a slave to expectations? Like, he says, I will set you free. The truth, the light shines. The truth comes. It sets you free, even from a sort of freedom that oftentimes we're not comfortable admitting we don't have. We rarely want to admit that we're in bondage, and yet Jesus acknowledges, and these people even say, what are you talking about? And he says, you know what I'm talking about. Verse 14, Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Like if you just keep living in your brokenness, if you keep living this out and letting the brokenness in your life drive who you are, you keep wandering in the dark. You keep fumbling around. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. We won't be lost. The lights will be on. We'll know where to go. We will know who to follow. And we will be free. Last week, if you were here, I mentioned this light that used to belong to my grandfather. That after he died, I somehow inherited it. And maybe in the back you can't see this, but like this is really old. And last week I was talking about this, and I wish you all could have been here when I plugged it in. Because those of you that were here, you know that I'm very scared every time I plug this thing in. But you guys can attest to this. Like, this is a frightening device. Like, we were talking, and it looks more like something you'd use to torture somebody with than something you would use as a tool. Like, this is like very old and antiquated. And truly, I said this last week, and those of you that weren't here, I'll say this. Like, every time I go to use this light, and I do use it, every time I go to use it, I'm always afraid that I'm going to die. Like, every time I'm like, you know what? I might as well just like jump in the pool with it in my hand, because that's just as, like, it seems as obvious, right, as trying to use this thing, because there's something dangerous about this light. And yet there's something beneficial about this light. If I gave this light to you, do you think you'd use it? Some of you, a little more daring, yeah? If I give this light to you, do you have to use it? If I give this light and you know the warning that this light is incredibly dangerous, aren't you tempted to maybe not use it? Here's a question. What's the difference between somebody who's fumbling in the dark and somebody who's walking in the light? Is it that they have the light? Or is it this? Right? Isn't that the difference? The difference between you or I walking in the light is not an issue of us having the light. You can believe all kinds of things about Jesus. You can possess the light. You can know the truths. The issue is whether or not you allow that light to illuminate your life. That's the difference between walking in the dark, fumbling in the night, and living and walking in the light. That is what explains why people who have the light, people who experience Jesus and have these moments of knowing who He is and believing very firmly in their faith, can suddenly wake up in moments of absolute, utter darkness, and you go, where's the light? Like, why am I here? How did this happen again? It happens because we have this hesitancy, because the light's dangerous. We have this tentativeness because the light is threatening. There's something about the light that says when we've been living in darkness, we've been living in bondage, we've been living a sort of life that's so much moving in a particular direction, the idea of anybody coming in and shedding light on that life, it makes us nervous. It makes us uncomfortable. We don't know how we feel about those things. Like if I let the light shine, it might show truth about the way that I'm feeling or thinking in particular areas of my life. And yet, the words of Jesus are that He is the light of the world. He's the light of our life. Like Jesus illuminates everything that we see. Everything that we see. The only way that we see it for what it really is. The only way that we understand our jobs. The only way that we understand our emotions. The only way that we can actually make sense out of our relationships is if Jesus, the light of the world, is shining in those things. And yet there's this tendency to shy away. There's this tendency to be nervous. We struggle with this. Why do we struggle with it? Well, we struggle with it because in the early days it's really easy, because the places where we first shine this light. We look at our life and there are these questions about why we're here and meaning and ultimate truth and how to connect with God. And we let the light shine in those areas of our life. And then we find ourselves going back out into every other day of our week and we just shut it off. We have these moments when we come back and we say, man, Jesus, I just need you to make sense of this. And so we turn the light on and everything makes sense in this moment. And then we go, okay, I don't know why I end up in those dark situations, but man, I'm glad I'm here right now. And then we go, all right, I got to go get back at it. And we turn the light off and we carry it out. And all of a sudden there's a work scenario, there's something that just unravels and we hate our jobs. And then we come back and we go, man, Jesus, what am I supposed to do about my job, right? Like shine some light in this situation. And then like we're looking for truth, we're looking for answers. And then we go, okay, I'm going to go back to work now. And we shine the light off, right? Or our marriages, right? Jesus, if you knew the things that she said to me, and he goes, I already do, right? And then you go, all right, okay, well, I'm just here for some truth. And then we just shut it off and we go right back to what we're doing. And the reason that we find ourselves in the darkness is that we're constantly turning the light off and on based on the convenience of the moment, based on whether or not we're comfortable with it. And yet we find ourselves waking up over and over again in darkness and wondering how we got there. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. There are dark corners of this world and there are dark corners of your life where you need to take my light and let it shine in there. Let it illuminate those places. That doesn't mean that suddenly things change. It doesn't mean that suddenly he gives you the answer. It means that suddenly in these moments when the light shines in the darkness, you see things the way that he sees things. You see scenarios and situations the way that he sees scenarios and situations. You understand yourself and your brokenness the way that he understands who you are in your brokenness. Suddenly you find yourself going, well, now I know why I have these conversations because there's these things that are going on, these questions that I'm asking. There's this wrestling that's taking place. We see the truth. The truth is revealed. We see things for how they are. But there's this tension, there's this uncomfortableness because we know, right? Like for some of us, we understand there's parts of our life where if we take this, we have to actually look at things that we've put away for a long time, right? Like, you know, when you shove things in the back of a closet or you put things in your basement, you just turn the lights off and you walk away. And you know they're there, but you're just going to keep going on with life, pretending that they're not there. And you're just nervous that at some point you're going to have to go back into the basement and you're going to have to go find that thing. A lot of us, there are things in our life, there are parts of our story that are so broken. There are things in our past that are so hurtful that the idea of turning the light on those things and going there is far too intimidating, right? Like, how could I go back to that place? I've just been hiding that in the dark. In fact, for some of us, it's like we're trying to outrun the light. I know when I mountain bike at night, I have lights on the handlebar of my bike. And there are times I can go so fast that the lights really do no good. Like I'm outrunning the light. Like by the time you see whatever it is you're about to hit, it's too late. That's how we live our life. Like there are these corners that are dark. There are things that I think about in my marriage or things I think about as a person or how I'm dealing with my desires or my values. Or there's things in my past that are shoved in some corner somewhere. And I'm moving so fast. If I can just outrun the light, if I can just fill my schedule, if I can just keep moving from event to event to event and from day to day, if I can pack my calendar and always have a vacation to look forward to, if I can always have a next thing, then I can keep moving. And maybe if I keep moving, I won't have to stop and let the light catch up and make me face what's in the dark corner of my life. Which is why we find ourselves waking up and going, how did I get here? Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. If you'll let this light shine, you won't walk in darkness. But it means that at some point, you and I have to surrender. We have to surrender the idea that we're in control and that we're free when we're really enslaved. We have to surrender to the idea that when Jesus said to us that any man who wishes to save his life will lose it, and anyone who loses it for my sake will find it, it means that there are times when we have to turn the light on and everything inside of us says, I'm about to let you shine in this area of my life, and I'm really uncomfortable with it. But that's what followers do. People that walk in the light, they look around their life and they say, are there dark corners? Are there dark places? Are there nooks and crannies where I'm just not letting the light shine? Are there places that need to be illuminated where I need to see the truth? Maybe about who I am or how I behave. It doesn't always give you the answer. You don't always wake up and go, well, that was good. I'm glad I spent that time letting Jesus shine his light in my life. Because now I have all the answers to my life. Sometimes you just realize, wow, for the first time I'm being honest about my life. And now I'm going to start walking that out. Now I'm going to start letting him be a lamp unto my feet. And I'm going to let the truth that he's revealed start influencing the choices that I'm making. So the reason that there can be millions of people worldwide who claim to be followers of Jesus and yet their lives don't look any different from anyone else is because the light's only shining in a very few corners of their mind and heart. Radical discipleship, really following Jesus, the threatening kind of stuff, the scary stuff happens when we start turning the light on and letting him lead. When we start walking into those places and letting his light shine. What does it take for us to trust him enough to do this? We have all of these philosophies, all of these answers, all of these ways of dealing with it. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And I can tell you stories. I can tell you stories about teenage girls who cut themselves. And they sit in their bedrooms alone and they wish they were somebody else. And they've tried everything in the world to resolve what's in their hearts. And then they experience the light of the world and everything changes. I can tell you about marriages where husbands have cheated on wives multiple times over and over and over again. Marriages where I've said to the wives, go, run, get away from him. And I've literally have seen the light of Jesus shine in the hearts of those marriages. And I've seen marriages become something I never imagined they would be. They walk in the light, not in the darkness. I've seen women who numb the pain of their childhood with alcohol, allow the light of the world to shine in their life. And suddenly there's this liberation, there's this walking in the light, in goodness, because they allowed Jesus to shine in those dark places. They stopped and said, what's really true? What's really going on here? Men who have been workaholics and angry and in pain, who finally stop and say, you know what, I got to do something about this. I have to let the light of Jesus shine in this. And their lives are radically altered because of it. Jesus comes into the world to give us the light. This whole season of Advent is this anticipation because the world was in darkness and so was I. And he said, here, I'm the light of the world. God being the loving God that he is, God being the God who respects us the way that he does, will never force you and I to turn the light on in our lives. He hands us the light and he says, it's up to you now. Will you let my light shine in those places? So the question that I'm asking myself that I'll ask you is this: where are the corners in my world where it's just dark? Some of those places are really obvious for some of us, right? Because it's a mess, right? It's a mess. You know it's dark, and it's obvious. Jesus, I need your light to shine. There are other places in our life where we are so used to living in the dark and so used to fumbling and so used to being enslaved. But when we get honest, we know, I think I need to get some light in here and some truth. We need to stop and say, Jesus, be the light unto my path. Be the lamp unto my feet. Will you pray with me? Will you just take some time right now? And would you just recognize and say, and like I said, some of these places may be really obvious, But then there are some places where maybe you're just resisting the light shining in. Would you just pause right now and stop the resistance and invite Jesus to illuminate the dark corners of your life? Invite him to show you truth about things that you haven't seen up until this point. Ask him to remind you of things that you knew to be true, you've known to be true, but you've walked away from them. Ask him to remind you of those things. Jesus, you are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. You illuminate the darkest places in our life. You illuminate the broken places. You illuminate the places where we're in bondage and enslaved. You illuminate and you show us things that I will admit they are not always easy to come to grips with. And yet your promise is so clear that when we follow you and we allow your truth to sink into those places, we won't walk in darkness. We won't walk in places where we wake up month after month or year after year and ask ourselves, how did I get here? Lord, you've promised us one of the few very, very distinctive promises that you've made regarding this life is that we won't have those moments if we will allow your light, your truth to shine in the dark corners of our life. And so this morning, Lord, we pray for the courage to dig deep, the courage to open up basement doors and locked closets. We pray for the courage to open up our marriages, to open up our homes, to open up our hearts, and the anger and the frustration, the sadness and the things that come out in these moments that speak to the bondage and the darkness. We ask for courage to open those things up and to let your light shine, that we would experience freedom. We love you, Lord. And in this season of Advent, we are all about acknowledging that you are who we have been waiting for. Thank you, Lord. We pray this in your name. Amen.